Good morning, everyone. Thank you for dedicating time to join us today. We trust you are well and keeping safe, especially with all that's going on around us. Columbia Global Centers Rio and Columbia Global Centers Nairobi welcome you to our webinar this evening. This is the third webinar in this series on COVID-19 and informal settlements. Today, we will be talking about stigma and discrimination in the midst of a pandemic. What's happening in informal settlements? Columbia Global Centers are a dynamic group of 9 centers positioned strategically around the world by Columbia University. The centers facilitate collaborations between Columbia universities, academic community, with local partners to engage in research and education activities, which also include serving as a platform for knowledge sharing and problem solving. This session will be recorded and the video will be posted on our YouTube page and website. As we proceed, you're most welcome to post your questions and comments in the Q&A section. Please feel free to indicate your location. You will find the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom application window. I would now like to hand over to our moderator today, Professor Amy Kapadia, who is a lecturer at Columbia University School of Social Work. Welcome, Professor Kapadia.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I've had the fortunate opportunity to join the first 2 panels, and I look forward to a very rich and wonderful discussion with our panelists. And this very, very important topic of stigma and discrimination, in particular in this time of COVID-19. So I'd like to start by introducing our wonderful panelists who have taken time to join us today, and want to also point out that we have 2 people with us who will be translating. Mora will translate in Swahili as needed, and Teresa from the CGC and Rio will translate in Portuguese. So I will start by introducing everyone. Professor Robinson Ocharo is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Work at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Ocharo has a PhD in Agricultural Extension, Masters of Arts in Rural Sociology and Community Development, as well as many certificates demonstrating his significant experience and expertise. He has over 25 years of work experience, including teaching, workshops, seminar facilitation, many webinars, as I've recently learned, and a lot of community work. His key competencies include community development with a focus on community mobilization and organization, disaster management and response, among other important work that I imagine he'll share more with us today. We also have from Nairobi, Christine Adiamo. Christine is a peer educator and community mobilizer who has been a resident in Mathare informal settlements for 20 years. Christine holds a high school diploma and has had the privilege of receiving a number of trainings, including gender-based violence, issues around the family, peer counseling, community health integration of HIV and AIDS, prevention of mother-to-child transmission, and she's worked with a number of organizations within Kenya. So welcome, Christine. And we have 2 panelists joining us today from Rio. Dr. Rita Borret holds a master's degree in public health and identifies as a Black lesbian family and community doctor. She works as a family physician in CF Antiado, and I apologize for my mispronunciation, Dr. Borret, a favela in the north part of Rio. Dr. Borret teaches a medical course as a member of the faculty at Estacio de Sa University. She is a current president of the Estate Association of Family and Community Doctors of Rio and the coordinator of the Black People's Health Working Group of the National Family and Community Medicine Society. So welcome to you as well. And finally, from Rio as well, we have Mariana Galdino. Marina is the educational leader at Cidade de Jesus, City of God, recently graduated from the State University of Rio de Janeiro with a law degree. Mariana is an academic coordinator of Os Ateros, leading students on their university entry exams. And she is also doing work with COVID-19, I believe, right, or in Rio, and you're an active member of Lab Jaca, a data gathering initiative in the Jacarezino favela. And again, we hope to learn more about everybody as we go forward. I'm going to share a little brief introduction before we start talking and ask into our question and answer period. Forgive me if I've gotten too excited and over-prepared, so you can wave to me if I'm going on too long, but I wanted to provide a little bit of context for our discussion today and provide a little bit of common language as well for us to sort of refer to as needed, give our audience a little bit of context. So COVID-19, as we all know, provides significant and distinct challenges for containing its spread and receiving adequate treatment in low resource settings. People living in informal settlements are some of the most vulnerable due to their high susceptibility of COVID-19, since basic needs are inadequate or non-existent. Unemployment, low-paying work, and high or risk work conditions, violence, challenges with substance use and mental health, all create added complexities in the fight against this virulent disease. Some of the strategies to contain the virus, such as purchasing masks and sanitizers, which are cost prohibitive even if available, and social distancing and self-quarantining becoming nearly impossible due to inadequate housing, issues with space, overcrowding, and the need for people to leave their homes in order to work. Police brutality and the enforcement of social distancing measures like curfews have added to the complexities and left people fearful and without needed basic resources. Finally, and importantly today, racism, stigma, and discrimination pose even further threats to safety as well as virus containment, which is where our focus will be today. Our discussion will center on the ways in which people in informal settlements have experienced stigma, racism, and discrimination, and how these historical, structural, and social forces work against the spread of COVID-19. I'll take a few minutes to share with you a little bit about some of the terms we'll use in our discussion today. Stigma and racism, while distinct constructs, have involved the lowering of persons and communities' value in society based upon particular categories and characteristics that are deemed unworthy or less than. Anti-Black racism, a global phenomenon with deep historical roots, is an example of devaluation in relation to dark, non-white skin color. Discrimination, we can consider it to be a component of the stigma process and an outcome of racism, is the behavioral response of devaluation that occurs on multiple levels within individual, community, and government and institutional levels. The concept of stigma offers an understanding of the process by which devaluation occurs. Without providing too much detail, a few important considerations include a separation between us and them, those who have socially driven, desirable characteristics, and those of us who do not, as well as the notion of power. Those in power within society actively stigmatize with the result of being discriminated that leads to inequality and injustice by determining who has access to education, knowledge, adequate housing, healthcare, running water and other basic needs, and other vital resources as well. We can talk about this kind of stigma as enacted stigma by people in power and those within the general population. Another term we might be familiar with is public stigma. We can also talk about stigma as internalized or self-stigma, where an individual or group who is devalued accepts the devaluation messages of inadequacy and also fears the experience of stigma and discrimination within the public sphere, which may lead to isolation, shame, and guilt. In both Brazil and Kenya, we have seen stigma and discrimination play out for people living with HIV/AIDS, for example, in the ways in which that impacts help seeking or being refused treatment. It is vital to keep close in this conversation today and always the pernicious influence of colonization, slavery, historical racism and discrimination against Black and Brown people and people with other marginalized identities in Kenya and Brazil and around the world, and to recognize the extensive impact it continues to have. And that ultimately brings us to my first question today as we discuss stigma, racism, and discrimination amidst this global pandemic that we're all experiencing. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to start off by asking my first question, and just so the panelists know, I'll just sort of guide us in the order of speaking, and I'll ask that you unmute when you're speaking and then mute again when you're finished. And then we'll go on to the next speaker. So my first question today to all of you is, in what ways does historical discrimination and racism against African and Black people influence present-day life in your communities? So I'd like to open up our discussion with Dr. Ocharo, followed by Christine, Dr. Borret, and Mariana. So Dr. Ocharo.
Thank you, Prof. The story of Kenya is quite interesting because if we bring in the constructs of racism, discrimination, you'll find that and slum settlement, you'll find at one point racism will take a different direction in Kenya after independence. It kind of becomes silent, but there are traces of that being practiced, but it's quite silent, not as pronounced as slums and in settlement areas, and what will have happened in terms of class discrimination and stigma. And that's what you'll find in the slums. I'll first look at racism before independence and what happens is that there was clear demarcation between in terms of treatment, in terms of segregation, in terms of attitude towards the other. There was a clear discrimination, there was clear isolation between the whites and the Blacks, or the indigenous Kenyans as a whole, and the colonizers who are the Britons. Now, you'll find that even in settlements, they said the settlements were in a way that we had what we call African reserves, where Africans were settled by the colonists, and we had the settlements that were occupied by the white settlers. And you'll find that where the white settlers were those areas were more developed than the reserves where the Africans were. Then what happened is that, and there's a joke that goes on up to date, that there was a clear discrimination between the whites and the Blacks, in that the joke in Kenya to date is that the colonialists or the whites used to treat their horses better than the Blacks. Of course, the Blacks used to work in their farms and go back to the reserves, which were not developed at all, and that is where they settled. Along the way, after winning our independence, now racism took a different stand, in that, of course, psychologically, what has been registered and passed on from one person to another, there is that psychological thinking of superiority when you see a white person, inferiority when it's a Black person. The turn it took in that there are those who are now classified as having lived the white person's life, those who settled on the lands and spaces that were settled by the white settlers. Well, I happen to be one of them. Well, because what happens is that Britain had to sell back the Kenyan land to the Kenyans. And therefore, you find that the well-to-do are the ones who settled in the developed areas because they could afford to buy that land. We call them settlement areas. And therefore, there was now, instead of racism taking a front row, class and class discrimination took the first role. And once that started, now we have the rich versus the poor, the black servant versus the black or the Kenyan servant versus the Kenyan employer, who now will treat the lower class in a way that is not human. Therefore, the discrimination that took place actually, and the subsequent settlement and classification was between the haves and the have-not. Now, this is black to black, and unlike what you find in other countries. Though, where the white comes in, the white person comes in, you'll find that thinking still there, and some of the interaction will actually clearly show that kind of discrimination, so that kind of stereotyping as to what a white skin is, a black skin is. And along the way now, we introduced another class that is very, very, the one that is the center of this discussion, that is very, very vulnerable to actually discrimination and stereotyping and prejudice. This is the slum dwellers or informal settlement dwellers. Of course, in search of employment, as urban centers were getting more industrialized in Kenya, they definitely, like any other country, you'll find those searching for lower cadre jobs were actually settled in slums. And the slum is definitely, as you have said, is characterized by congestion, is characterized, quote unquote, by criminal behaviors, is characterized, quote unquote, I will visit those quote unquotes, by diseases, and everybody points the fingers. They highly vulnerable are the slum dwellers, and therefore they're highly discriminated. So basically what we are dealing with in Kenya today is not more racism, though it's there silently, it's more class discrimination. Because unlike other countries, if you go to South Africa, you'll find where the ghettos are is the blacks who are settled there. Where the developed areas are, you find the white people are settled there. That's not the scenario in Kenya. Now, the scenario in Kenya is that it's black to black, by and large, though we have, like recent cases, we have had issues to do with China and Kenya and discrimination and racism. Some of the issues are in court, some have led to deportation because of what, the way we've been socialized, the black skin versus the white skin. And therefore, that stays in one's mind for forever, as long as they don't inhibit that way of thinking. Now, what is happening in slums, and why the discrimination, why stigma, why prejudiced behaviors between the rest of us and this formal in settlement. Unlike other countries, our welfare is one that has seen up and downs, and therefore, like you say, like in the US, there's a claim to what people are entitled. Entitlement is not the same in Kenya here, because we started purely as a welfare state. If you look at the first National Development Plan, actually that plan was basically a welfare plan, though we call it socialist plan. And in this case, the government provided for the basics. The state provided for the basics. Now, along the way, as the state was providing for the basics, free education, free healthcare. I remember I even tell my student that the free space for us to have fun, play, that is free parks and free social halls. That changed along the way. Why did it change? Because the freeness here was actually money borrowed from World Bank and IMF. And in the mid-80s, actually, there was the welfare aspect was draining the country. And down the line, Kenya, like any other countries that had borrowed heavily, were given the condition of structural adjustment. And this is where now the slum people, informal settlement people, are getting affected, and the reason for their being vulnerable, and the reason for their being discriminated because they can't fit in that class, and the reason for their being treated as another group of Kenyans, another lot of Kenyans, is that with this condition of IMF and World Bank, where the condition was that the state has to charge for every service they offer. Now it's no longer free. Charging for health, charging for education, there are those who could not afford at all. And therefore they went kind of under their class, and they fit squarely on what we call the underclass.
Professor Ocharo,
they can't afford all this, and therefore, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is such a very important, rich historical context that will certainly guide our conversation. I'd love to open this question up to our friends in Brazil,
yes.
So we can get that context as well. Dr. Borret, would you mind sharing about the historical discrimination experiences in your communities? To take yourself off the, thank you.
Okay, I'll just start by saying that if by any chance on the way that I speak, this represents something that people in speaking English are not used to, are not used to listening, then I apologize. I'm just trying to translate how we name racism and Black people's experience here in Brazil. So I've been asking for Teresa to help me. And every time that I talk on Black people health, what I'm saying is that we are including here in Brazil Blacks and brown, which doesn't translate quite well, but we're talking about people that are not only Black people, but people who are a mixed race, but are not understood and read as white people here in Brazil. So that's something important for us to try to get a common ground. Okay, so trying to talk a little bit about the history of our country. We are a country in America that has lived slavery for over 300 years. And by the time that we come to the abolition of slavery, what happens in Brazil is that this phenomenon doesn't happen in a way that includes Black people in the society. On the opposite, to be quite honest. In 1888, when we have the abolition of slavery, what we also have is a whole bunch of laws that will try to marginalize Black people. So we'll put the Black people on the margins of the society by not giving them opportunities to live, opportunities to work, and opportunities to have lands to plant. Something that is also quite important to understand is that by the same time that we have in Brazil the abolition and we have laws that will try to marginalize Black people, we also have a politic that will try to bring people from Europe and give them the rights and the benefits to come to Brazil and have lands and have housing and have the opportunity to organize their lives here in Brazil. And this was an idea to try to turn the population into a whiter population here in Brazil, because by the time that we had the abolition in the end of the 18th century, 19th century, we had almost 80% of people who were Black people, who were enslaved people coming from Africa here to Brazil. So this is something that it's very important. And when we are talking about informal settlements, especially here in Brazil, we will talk about favelas. That's how we call slums here in Brazil. We call them favelas. And the favelas, the first favela that appears here in Brazil, the name is Morro da Providência, and it's a favela that starts exactly by the fact that we had a whole bunch of people, Black people, who are now free. And I'll put some quotes when I say free, because what is freedom and what we understand as freedom. And these people are now free, but they don't have any opportunities. So they're trying to get a housing as possible as they can. And we have the organizations of cortiços, which were the first ways of informal settlements. We would have houses which over 2,000, 3,000 people would stay and would not have any basic needs as well. And in the beginning of the 20th century, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro decides that these cortiços are not a good idea. It do not look beautiful in the city. So they try to bring this housing down, and the Black people living in these cortiços, they will take the part of this cortiço, and they will go to the hills in the city. And in the hills of the city, they are going to make their housing, because this part of the town, this marginalized part of the town, was not interesting to the white people. So they could stay there and they could live there. And that's how the favelas starts in our country, in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. So I think that's extremely important for us to understand how the favelas are also a result of the process of abolition that we had here in Brazil. And when we talk about this abolition process, we also talk about a whole bunch of people with not access to job and to education. And when we talk about unemployment in Brazil, this is extremely important, because we have so many people unemployed, we have an economy that can offer jobs. They are subhuman, they are not human, and they are not dignifying. So people will do it and take their jobs because they do need to find ways to get to survive hunger, to survive, and to have a means of sustain their families. So this is something extremely important that I have to bring to the discussion today. And nowadays, because we're talking about history, and sometimes people would ask me like, oh, but this was in the 19th century, this was in the 20th century. We are now 2020. What's different? When we look to the 4% of the unemployed people in Brazil are Black people still. So nothing changed. Nothing changed quite much. And also when we look to the percentage of the population who are poor in Brazil, like the 10% of the population who has less money in Brazil, we are talking about 3/4, 75% of this population, the poorest population, they are Black people here in Brazil as well. So, and just to finish and to give the word to Mariana, I'd like to remember that in Brazil we have a big problem, which is called racial democracy myth. So we had in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, a sociologist named Gilberto Freire, who writes a book explaining to the world how in Brazil we have a social democracy, how in Brazil a racial democracy, how in Brazil it doesn't matter if you're Black or if you're white, everyone is respected as well. And that has never been true. But by the idea of having a racial democracy in Brazil, what we do understand is that the white people would be in an hegemonic power because they earned it, because they deserve it. and Black people would be in other conditions because they were not good enough to be in other positions. So this has always organized the way our society, our Brazilian society, sees and understands racism. So it's still 2020, very hard for us to talk about racism because people still believe that we do live in a racial democracy society. I think these are some important background for us to understand the context of Brazil and racism here in Brazil.
Yeah. Dr. Borret, thank you so much. Both of you have provided such important historical context that helps us to move forward in thinking about present day experiences. And I think I'm going to skip to my question 3, and I'd like to start with Christine and then Mariana to bring you both into the conversation. Now that we're understanding and thinking about the historical context in both of these communities, I'd like to think about or take some time to talk about the historical lasting impact and how stigma and racism and discrimination is influencing our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would like to kind of draw a parallel between the history, current day situations relating to racism, stigma, and discrimination, and its impact on how your communities are managing and struggling with the containment of and the impact of COVID-19. So Christine, I'll start with you and Mariana, and then I'll invite Dr. Borret and Dr. Ocharo to jump in as well.
Naomba Lena nisaidie.
Sawa. Christine, sababu tumeshapewa, wameongelea mambo ya historia ya Kenya na haya mambo ya stigma, kutengwa, vile yamekuwa yakifanyika. Sasa swali ni, tumevuka kwa swali la 3. Sasa swali ni kwamba ni kwa njia zipi ambazo huku kutengwa kwenyu kwa kihistoria pengine yamechangia vile mambo ya COVID-19 yanachukuliwa kwa jamii yako?
Mimi naishi Mathare, na shida yenye tunapata Mathare ni kana kwamba watu wanaogopa kwa sababu hawana ile pesa ya kulipa. Kwa sababu unaambiwa uende upimwe, na ukipatikana na COVID-19 kuna pesa unastahili kulipa na ni 2,000, ambapo kwa mwana Kenya ambaye anaishi pale kwa slums hawezi afford kulipa hilo pesa.
I will translate that first.
Yeah.
She says that she lives in Mathare, and because most people there live in poverty, there's been an issue with this COVID-19 time that people are afraid to go get tested because if you get tested, there's a fee, and they find that you're positive, you have to pay 2,000 Kenya shillings, that's about $20 a day for the number of days that you're being held there. So that has scared many people from going to get tested.
La pili, kuna kuhofu. Nimeenda pale, nimepatikana na ugonjwa wa COVID-19, na mostly wenye wanaka pale Mathare ni widowers, single mothers, single ladies wenye wajatoka kwa ndoa, pia kuna wengine wanaishi peke yao. So mtu anaogopa, tuseme kama mama ambaye akona watoto, bwana alimfia akamwacha na watoto, ama ni yule single mother ambaye alitoka kwa ndoa, ameenda pale akapimwa. Wale watoto wake wenye anaacha pale nyuma, nani anatake responsibility? So hiyo inakuwa ni uoga kwa wale wa mama ambao wanaishi pale katika hiyo kijiji.
Christine says that there is a profound fear mostly among women who are single mothers, who do not have anyone else to support them. So just in case someone, in these times of COVID, if they find you with COVID, you definitely have to be in quarantine for a while. So the fear is that who's going to take care of your children, who takes responsibility for them in case you go, so then that keeps them off the testing.
Cha tatu kenye nitaongezea, kitu yenye nitaongezea ikilingana na pale kijiji, nimepelekwa pale quarantine, nimepatikana niko na hii COVID-19, nitakaa pale for 14 days, nikirudi kwa ile mtaa yenye naishi, wale watanitenga, watoto wangu pia nitapata kama wametengwa, familia pia itanitenga, na plus na marafiki zangu. So hiyo ndio kitu yenye inafanya sana watu wanaogopa kuenda kupimwa.
To finish off, she says that once you've been tested and you've gone to quarantine and they've retested you and it's negative, you go back to your community. There's a lot of stigma around that. People are going to avoid you. By the time you get back there and your neighbors knew that you tested positive for it, you've been under quarantine, no one is going to get near you. So you are going to be left alone. So that's another fear.
Christine, thank you so much. That was so valuable to hear about these everyday experiences and the very real fears that people have. And we can sort of start to see how these kinds of reactions are interrelated with the ways in which we can respond to the containment of the pandemic, and also helps us to sort of think about the importance of social support and how this pandemic and other factors are creating isolation and because of stigma, etc. Thank you so much. Mariana, I'd love you to join in. I'll just repeat the question. How has historical stigma and racism and discrimination influenced and created challenges to how we're dealing with COVID-19? You can also feel free to share your own experiences of stigma and discrimination if you're willing.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Can you hear me? And now, guys, I will talk in Portuguese. And Teresa, I hope you help me. Primeiramente, queria agradecer a oportunidade de estar aqui falando com todos vocês. É realmente um sonho que também não é um sonho somente individual, mas é um sonho coletivo, de poder estar aqui hoje compartilhando um pouquinho das questões pessoais, subjetivas que o nosso povo acaba vivenciando e por muitos momentos acabam sendo silenciados das agendas políticas, das agendas acadêmicas, das agendas centrais do mundo, né? Queria agradecer também a companheira Rita, que a gente ainda não se conhece pessoalmente, mas estamos tocando projetos juntas, né? E aí agradecer por ela ter colocado de forma brilhante a trajetória histórica e um contexto que as pessoas negras passam aqui no Brasil. Diferentemente de como o doutor... Ok, sorry, Teresa.
I'm not a translator, so I'm gonna keep interrupting you so I don't...
Okay.
I'll try to be faithful as possible to your answers.
Okay.
So Mariana is starting off just by thanking everybody for being here. She says this is a dream come true, not only a personal dream, but a collective one that is giving voices to those who she works with. And she would like also to especially thank Dr. Rita to give us such a concise and well-rounded historical context of what Brazil is and what it means to be a Black person in Brazil, what racism means in Brazil, and what the, how do you say, the notion of racial democracy in Brazil is, and what we're going to discuss later on. So.
Isso. Então, acho que nesse ponto é fundamental que a gente retome de forma bem rápida o que a Rita comentou, né? Que aqui no Brasil, diferentemente de como o doutor Ocharo estava falando sobre Quênia, né? E um pouco dessa discriminação com relação à classe, aqui no Brasil a gente tem a questão racial realmente como central e determinante como as relações sociais vão se dar, né? E aí a gente percebe que, mesmo com esse mito da ascensão social do negro no Brasil, a gente percebe como que a questão racial ela realmente vai atravessar as nossas vidas em todos os sentidos, inclusive no sentido da saúde.
Okay, so she's reiterating what Dr. Rita Borret said before in terms of racial discrimination and class discrimination, right, Mariana? If you can repeat the last part you mentioned in regards to access of health to health as well, I'd appreciate that.
Can I? Ok. Então, quando a gente vivencia esse momento, né, de uma democracia racial, a gente também começa a vivenciar, enquanto pessoas negras que são deslegitimadas da violência que a gente vivencia, um processo imenso, contínuo, diário, da desumanização dos nossos corpos, né? Então, quando a gente está enfrentando, por exemplo, uma pandemia, é difícil para o nosso povo e também, e não só para o nosso povo, mas é extremamente desafiador para a gente que, enfim, estamos nas comunidades, estamos na favela, de tocar as políticas públicas, né, de resposta a essa pandemia, justamente porque a gente vivencia numa sociedade racista, né, que não nos contempla com políticas públicas que vão colocar as nossas demandas em centro, né? As formas como a gente vem colocando os desafios no Brasil é sempre de forma vertical.
I will never be able to do Mariana's speech justice because she's so eloquent and she's speaking the truth about what happens here in Brazil. And I do apologize to Mariana for this.
No, it's okay.
I really do, but here we go. So Black people here are ostracized by society in general. Their bodies are discriminated against. And when it comes to a pandemic, it gets even worse because the public power or the public government, which should be accessing you, everybody who's already ostracizing that community, emphasizes even more race discrimination and racism here in Brazil. So not only were you being suffering discrimination before just by being Black, but now you are Black and you're ill, right? And you have a pandemic going on, you're ostracized even more because if if the government won't access you before, it wouldn't access you right now. I hope I managed to give a general sense of what it was, Mariana. So please continue.
It's fine. E continuando, né, e um processo que a gente percebe também muito grande devido a essa verticalização das decisões governamentais e não colocar as nossas demandas, as nossas narrativas no centro, o que a gente percebe, principalmente dentro das favelas, é que o Covid-19 ele vem chegando como mais um instrumento de morte para o nosso povo, né? E o que a gente vivencia também.
Okay, I'll stop you because this is really important and I want to make sure I got this right. She's saying that due to the verticalization of power here, right? And the demands, what demands you mentioned? As demandas?
As demandas do nosso e as narrativas do nosso povo, elas não estão colocadas no centro.
Okay, and the narratives of their people are being used as an instrument, as a tool by the public power to ostracize them even more, right? So is that right? I think yes. Okay.
E com isso que a gente o que a gente percebe, principalmente no senso comum, né, da população nas favelas e nas comunidades periféricas, é exatamente um olhar um tanto quanto, tudo bem, é um Covid-19, está matando o nosso povo, mas quantas tantas outras formas também não matam o nosso povo, né? E o que a gente vê, né, dessa democracia racial, que também vai levar à desumanização, é a naturalização da violência, né? Então, para a gente poder chegar, comunicar que o Covid-19 é muito sério, né? Como a branquitude tem dialogado nas mídias, né, e tem sofrido esse impacto, para o nosso povo, esse impacto de violência já chegou aqui há muito tempo. Então, é difícil até para a gente, enquanto, enfim, comunicadores e líderes desses lugares, poder comunicar que, olha, há algo acontecendo. E aí a pessoa olha para a gente assim, há algo a mais acontecendo, porque não é como se isso fosse algo novo.
Okay.
Então, só vou terminar aqui.
I'll interrupt you again. I'm definitely not doing justice to Mariana. Again, I apologize, but the general the general idea is that so the violence of what COVID means to people in favelas and people in informal settlements, and the notion of racial democracy exacerbates another level of violence that Black people experience here. Is that right, Mariana? So yeah. The idea of trying to communicate with the communities in favela that COVID-19 is highly dangerous, is life-threatening, is not necessarily a priority because they're being violated in so many other ways that COVID-19 is not necessarily their main threats, right?
Exato. E só para finalizar um pouco, para os companheiros a gente continuar fazendo essa troca, no que tange a questão da estigmatização e do racismo, né, da discriminação dentro da nossa sociedade, é exatamente, no final das contas, a quem culpabilizar, né? No caso, pensando no Brasil, a pandemia e como ela vai se repercutir, a quem ela vai contaminar, a quem ela está servindo de alguma forma. Então, o que a gente percebe hoje na mídia brasileira é justamente a procura de alguém ou de um grupo a se culpar, já que não estamos conseguindo manter uma quarentena, justamente porque temos uma agenda neoliberal. Quer que eu pare? Eu posso parar.
Yes. Okay, so to finish off, in terms of stigmatization and discrimination, Mariana is saying that, for example, the media is looking for who to blame, who's the blamed one to that keeps spreading COVID, who keeps going out on the street and not respecting isolation orientations. But what happens is, so Black people who are already discriminated against, who already need to go after their informal jobs because they have not had access to formal jobs and have not had job securities, they need to go out and they keep spreading the disease, as if to say that. But this is a neoliberal agenda that is blaming those who are already ostracized into spreading the disease. So it's a pretty backwards mentality of what happens. So they keep blaming those who they are not helping, those who are being violated and suffering violence on a constant basis. So thank you, Mariana.
Thank you.
Mariana, thank you so much. You know, it's difficult to hear these strong terms: racial democracy, violence, violation, and there's a pain there, and I wanted to acknowledge that I'm imagining this is very difficult for our panelists to share so openly, as well as for audience members to hear and process, as we're, many of us are experiencing or have experienced or working with people who are experiencing these kinds of violations every day. And thank you so much for that very, very important contribution to our discussion. That notion of racial democracy has struck me, so I appreciate that a lot. You know, I don't understand the time, but the time is running from us today, and I feel like we could just spend days talking, and I'm kind of sad that we're not able to do that in the way that I would love, and I'm sure that is important for us to do. What I think I'd like us to do is go back and have everybody share, whether you share some more lived experiences from yourselves or your communities, and or strategies and recommendations to address these structural blocks, if you will, during this pandemic and beyond. So I'd like to open up the last few minutes before we then hear from our audience. I know that it's a few minutes left, so why don't we, if it's okay, we'll start with Professor Ocharo, and then Dr. Borret and Christine and Mariana, again, sharing whether it's lived experiences and or strategies and recommendations.
Thank you. I'll go straight to the point and pick it from actually the Kenyan experience. Picking it from Christine. Two quick points that I've picked and which needs to be addressed urgently. One thing that Christine has demonstrated and what we have said as sociologists is that in this informal settlement, the only social connection they have is basically horizontal connection. Slum versus slum, underclass versus underclass. So it becomes so difficult for them to look to anywhere else for assistance. And that's why she said they fear coming out, they fear going testing and so on and so forth. So again, coupled with the lack of employment and what Mariana said, of course, they have to go out and look for a job because they're doing casual labor. They have to go out. So with that, the media, again, put it correctly, will pick it and say, fine, these are the people spreading it. You see, we find quick fixes by blaming the underclass. The second thing I picked is about the attitude, which needs to be changed now with a straight recommendation for this. Attitude of the underclass needs to be changed because already they have conceptualized COVID-19 as death, not as a disease. And this, we need programs that will change the attitude. In fact, this morning I was saying we need strong counseling programs to reach to the underclass of our communities and package this pandemic in a way that they should accept and follow the rules smoothly. The second recommendation, whether we like it or not, I stopped at where welfare in Kenya literally died. And therefore, everybody's on his own, on our own. Therefore, what do you do with a person who is underclass, who is doing casual labor, and who needs to feed and has no package from the state? Now, the state, my recommendation, a strong one, has to move in and address the welfare, even if it means short term, of the underclass. That is my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Borret?
Okay, I think as you may have realized, here in Brazil we talk a lot, but I'm extremely happy because Mariana has said almost everything that I was planning to say also on the other question. So I'm glad that we're being able to complete ourselves, and it's quite a pleasure to have her here in the panel as well. So some important things that I'd like to talk on the community experience. It's important to say, first of all, that I work as a doctor in Jacarezinho favela, but I do not live there. So I have different experiences. And I think this is something important to acknowledge. So because of racism and the intersectionality with classism, when we talk on favelas, something that happens is that for the middle class people in Brazil, it is possible to go throughout their lives without truly understand what happens in a favela scenario, because the media gives Brazilian two options to understand favelas from the outside. One option is to understand favelas as being a place that produce violent people, that produce violence, that produce marginalization and people that are not in agreement with the law. This is one option. And the other option is to understand favela as a place where people struggle in their life, but they are extremely happy, and they understand this struggle as something to get better and to survive as something that is meritocratic. So to truly understand what goes on in a favela, I can say that I'm working there for 5 years in a favela setting, and I do not fully understand what happens there. But when we talk about public policies, what normally happens is that the government here in Brazil silence and invisualize what happens in the favelas. So when we do have the Ministry of Health saying that people should wash their hands and people should stay home because staying home is the way to prevent from getting coronavirus, what we do understand is that the government do not realize that there are a lot of people in Brazil that has not access to water, to running water. There are a lot of people here in Brazil who doesn't have access to a housing. And there's a lot of people here in Brazil who cannot do, how can we say that? Isolamento social, social isolation in their house, because there are 5, 6, 7 people living in a very small house. So pretty much like Prof. Ocharo was saying before. Something that also happens here in Brazil because of the idea of favela as producing violence is that for the whole population, it has been naturalized, the police violence here in the favelas. So what we, it's interesting to see, and I apologize to bring this subject, but when we see and when we hear about George Floyd's death in US, 2 weeks before, we had a young Black guy named João Pedro, who has been shot death in his house. And this has not made the Brazilian population commote and shocked on this matter. People was okay with that because it's something that happens every day. It's something that is not supposed to bring revolt. I believe that that should be the word. So for us, this is very important. And when our president goes to the media and says, for those who can stay home, this is extremely discriminating, because we do know who is the people who cannot stay home, who has to go to work to survive hunger, to survive other types of violence. And for those people, it would be the responsibilization of the government to give them ways to stay home, and not to say on the media, if you can, you stay home. This is extremely wrong. And when Mariana talks about it's another way of killing people, we would call that necropolitics, which would say we have in Brazil a government who decides the value of life according to the race of people. So for the white people, it's okay to live, but for Black people, it's also okay to die. That's what we have here in Brazil. And when we leave the pandemic here in our country, something that we've experienced is what I've been trying to call selective solidarity. We have a lot of people, they are extremely solidary in between them, but also in visualizing the people living in favelas, in visualizing what happens with people who cannot do social isolation, and people who would stay home and protect their family, but also keep their housekeeping, going to the work and exposing them to the risk of infection. And on the other hand, what we do have in the favelas is the true meaning of solidarity. We have people actually helping each other and actually trying to find ways in which how to survive the pandemic and how to survive hunger as it really happens in our country. So when I'm here, and I'm extremely happy to be here with Mariana, because we have seen and we have helped some solidarity organizations that are outside of the government, because people in favela are not waiting for the government to help them, because they do already know that it's not going to happen. So what they are trying to do is that they're trying to find funds and trying to find ways to survive the pandemic, actually understanding their context. And some public health clinics in primary care are trying to work together with this solidarity local groups in order to give information that actually applies for the context, in order to open their minds into other kinds of violence that can happen, like domestic violence for the women living in favelas, for the police violence that keeps happening as well, and for a whole bunch of other stuff that the media and the government decides to silence and decides not to watch, not to see, and not to do something about it. I think that was some of the things that I like to bring for us to talk and to
Dr. Borret, thank you so much. Again, that sometimes these terms, necropolitics, it really strikes you and highlights the real impact. And it sounds like there are a lot of local movements for people on the ground, demonstrating their own resilience, their own strengths, to do what they can, as you said, to survive. I read something recently that said social isolation and social distancing is a luxury for many of the reasons you've shared today. Very important messages. We have very little time, but I do want Christine and Mariana to jump in with sort of their last sort of comments about experiences with stigma and discrimination and recommendations you might have within the communities you live and work. So I'd like to start with Christine.
Nirudie swali, Christine. Unmute. Nirudie swali. Kwa kumalizia, angependa kuuliza recommendation zako au tuseme pendekezo kwa Kiswahili kuhusu haya mambo ya COVID-19 vile umeishi huko na stigma.
Ikilingana vile nakaa pale Mathare, kwa upande wangu ningependa kuambia serikali yangu iweze kupeana free quarantine, mtu akienda pale apate services na siweze kuidaiwa kitu, aweze kulipa. Jambo lingine ningependa kuomba government wangu wanafaa kuchukua jukumu ya kuhamasisha community, kama wakati HIV ilikuja, watu walikuwa wanaambiwa wanaenda kwa support groups ndio waweze kupata ile vile wanaweza kukaa na watu katika kijiji. Waache kupeana ni discrimination kwa watu wenye wamepatikana na hiyo ugonjwa. Lena.
I'll please translate. The first thing that she notes is that for her, she'd like to make a recommendation that the government should take responsibility for the cost of people who have suffered from this COVID-19, so meet the treatment, to encourage people to get tested and then go out there to seek the services. The second point she's making is that it's important to sensitize people, that the government keeps sensitizing people again and again. Just like the time when HIV and AIDS was discovered, and there were a lot of issues around that, and stigma and discrimination, and the government took charge and set people on the ground, and then they spoke to others, and then the community embraced anyone who was suffering from it and made their lives better. So if the government took the same stance that it took that time, then it is likely to end stigma.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christine. Mariana, hate to say this, but I think you might have the final comments, and then we'll open up the panel for the audience questions.
Ok, vou tentar ser breve então. Quanto às recomendações, né, as estratégias, uma coisa que eu conversei inclusive com a Tereza era justamente que pensar o racismo e estratégias de combater o racismo, ele é como se fosse uma pergunta de $1 milhão, né? É a que a gente mais tenta realmente refletir, pensar e colocar em prática. Eu acredito, e assim como tantos outros, acredito que Rita também, acredito que, primeiramente, nas recomendações, a gente deveria começar a realmente trazer uma proposta horizontal, né, das narrativas e das demandas, né? Como a Rita estava falando anteriormente, como funciona um pouco da questão aqui no Brasil, da saúde pública principalmente, a gente aqui tem o SUS, né? E o SUS, ele é um modelo de saúde pública aqui no Brasil, que enfim, é um modelo internacionalmente falando, né? E a gente vivencia aqui dentro grandes desafios, né, para a manutenção dele, para a garantia dele, principalmente da qualidade dele, né? E é algo que principalmente... Oi, desculpa!
Sorry, let me interrupt. I don't want to miss a thing that you mentioned, but sorry. So just in terms of, recommendations and strategy on how to fight and combat racism and stigma, Mariana says that's the $1 million question, right? How do you address that issue when you won't even allow people to share their own narratives and propose their own narratives? And Mariana, I'll ask you to talk again about SUS. SUS, just to give you a context, is the universal access, health access here in Brazil. So the system, the only, SUS would be Sistema Único de Saúde, the only health system, I guess, here, right?
Sim, e através dele, tantas outras políticas públicas, é que a gente consegue perceber de que forma a gente pode realmente começar a combater as desigualdades sociais, econômicas, enfim, identitárias, e a gente percebe, na verdade, exatamente isso, né? Que quando uma política pública é implementada e quando ela é principalmente focalizada para um grupo que foi marginalizado durante toda a sua história, é justamente ali que a gente tem um sucateamento absurdo, grande, né, e desafiador para os agentes de saúde pública que estão ali colocados, acredito que assim como a Rita, né? E algumas estratégias para além disso é justamente a estratégia de escuta, que é uma coisa que a gente, quando, né, eu, assim como Rita, né, eu morei na favela até meus 17 anos, eu morei na Cidade de Deus até meus 17 anos. E uma coisa que eu sempre tento praticar e pratico coletivamente, né, com os colegas, enfim, parentes que ainda moram dentro da comunidade, é justamente a gente começar a ter um olhar cada vez menos colonizado realmente da nossa própria realidade e começar a praticar que representar. E aí é uma coisa que eu vou trazer da Bell Hooks, né, que é uma coisa que ela fala que é fundamental, ok?
Sorry. So, Mariana is saying when you have a system just like SUS, which is the universal healthcare here in Brazil, being used as a tool for public policy, I apologize. I'll get back to this, but I'll finish with her last part. in terms of strategies to combat stigma and discrimination would be first to have a trained hearing, listen to what people have to say, and try to train that understanding of what happens in these stigmatized and ostracized communities. Mariana, if you can tell me again, because I'm not sure I understood exactly what you meant by SUS being a tool for combating stigma and discrimination. I'd appreciate that.
Ok.
Como se você puder repetir como é que o SUS é usado como uma ferramenta no combate a... E Rita, help me out and please feel free to join in.
Eu estava falando exatamente, né, que o SUS, enquanto uma política pública, e a Rita vai conseguir falar ainda melhor do que eu, ele, né, enquanto projeto político, né, pensando um pouco da teoria dele, é justamente para poder combater essas desigualdades sociais e universalizar o acesso à saúde, que é tão fundamental para o andamento social das nossas vidas.
Okay, so SUS is supposed to be a tool that would give, right, access, equal access to everybody. It's supposed to be a functioning tool, right?
Isso. E o que acontece, na verdade, é que toda política pública voltada justamente a combater essas desigualdades são sucateadas, né? E a gente vivencia hoje uma pandemia que, mais uma vez, o lugar onde nosso povo deveria estar sendo extremamente acolhido, né, e aberto, estamos vivendo um grande desafio exatamente pelo sucateamento, né? E aí começa aquela história toda de que, na verdade, não se tem o dinheiro para investimento, não se tem isso, não se tem aquilo. E aí, como na verdade a gente, como por exemplo a Rita, precisam de se desdobrar para fazer acontecer realmente a prática daquela teoria que foi dada inicialmente.
So what should be a tool like SUS that is supposed to be there to give access to everybody for basic healthcare, for example, ends up being what would be sucateado, Rita? Ends up being dismembered and dismantled by the public government, be it through corruption or money laundering, you name it, right? Ends up not being a tool that will help, but ends up being a tool that is going to emphasize social discrimination, racial discrimination, and whatnot, right?
Exato. E aí, só para finalizar, já que a gente tem pouco tempo, terminando falando exatamente sobre essa questão das favelas e o estigma que a gente carrega da nossa própria imagem, né? Entender a favela também como um lugar de potência, um lugar que se reinventa diariamente, e entender que como ela foi construída inicialmente, né, foi justamente num processo no qual o Estado, estruturalmente racista, né, foi condenando o nosso povo, majoritariamente negro, foi marginalizando o nosso povo, colocando às margens. A gente ali dentro vai se reinventando e se potencializando a partir também de uma autonomia, né? E aí é uma questão muito grave das mídias, da grande mídia, é justamente representar esse lugar de forma extremamente negativa, violenta, quando na verdade é um lugar de reinvenção, né? E aí foi onde eu citei a Bell Hooks, né? Que ela fala da importância das representações culturais, porque ali também se constrói as subjetividades, né? E a partir da subjetividade a gente consegue construir um lugar realmente de pertencimento, de reconhecimento das dores.
Okay, so just to finish off.
Eu falo muito, desculpa.
No, one that needs to apologize. And again, everybody, this will be on our YouTube channel. I'd be happy to sit down and write everything that Mariana has said, just to make sure that you all have access to the rich content that she's bringing. But just to finish off what she says, so people in the favelas, not only do they carry the stigma amongst themselves, right? But they are in the constant need of reinventing themselves as a community, as people with very high cultural background and cultural richness that they need to keep emphasizing, and they need to detach their image constantly from what the media usually brings, that the favelas are very dangerous, the favelas are very violent, don't go to the favelas because, you know, this and this might be bad and happen to you. So they're constantly reinventing themselves, such as with the pandemic, for example. They're bringing, and I'll refer back to our first webinar that we had with Thiago Nascimento, who's leading a program called Jaca LED, in which Jaca Contra Corona, which is our initiatives that should be invested upon, because these are the ones who are actually bringing innovative and culturally rich and data rich initiatives amongst favelas, right? Is that right, Mariana? So
yes,
they should be constantly reinventing themselves and to enforce that their narrative is being listened to is very important. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And Teresa, I so
Thank you.
appreciate your humility and the very challenging work of translating people's voices. I think that you're doing such a wonderful, caring job with it. So I'm going to try to just highlight a few of the recommendations and strategies that all of our panelists have shared, and then we'll move on to the audience questions. I see a few that David is sending to me. So first and foremost, across Brazil and Kenya, what I've been hearing is a very strong need for a governmental support to support these local communities in accessing basic needs, in providing ways in which to manage with this pandemic in terms of how to social distance and how to isolate and yet earn an income, very real important components. Also, the importance of being able to share stories of lived experiences, to recognize and honor the historical context that has tremendous impact on what happens today, and getting those stories out. And as Mariana was sharing, that need to feel that you have to keep proving who you are in a lot of ways, and how perhaps through public interventions, through interventions that target public stigma, there are ways in which to allow voices to be shared and truths to come out, as opposed to stigmatizing and discriminating media accounts and as well as government accounts. It sounds like as well that these very rich, wonderful local movements really do require support from the government. As much as they're doing such amazing work, there are limitations given the challenges and constraints. And finally, education and counseling is something else that I heard. That are needed in our informal settlements and favelas, to understand more about the facts around COVID, more about the ways in which we can prevent it, and also support for the mental health implications of all of this, of all of what we've talked about. I have not done justice to what everyone has shared today, but I would like to open this up to some of the audience questions. And I think I'll start with the question, this one is directed to Christine. So Mara, if you can just sort of pay attention and translate for us, that would be great. The question is, Christine, would you say stigma and discrimination in the settlements, the experiences is largely internal to the settlement, or is it coming from people living outside of the settlement? So it sounds like where does the stigma come from and the discrimination come from is what this person is asking.
Christine,
Yes.
wanaulizia mambo ya stigma huku kutengwa. Sana sana iko kati yenyu nyinyi ama pia watu wa nje wanawatenga?
Lena, nikiongelelea kuhusu stigma, stigma iko kati yetu na pia stigma iko kwa wale wadosi ambayo watu wetu wanaenda kuwafanyia kazi. Kwa sababu niseme mama ambayo anakaa Mathare pale mimi naishi, unaona tuko karibu na Isili, na wale ni watu ambayo wamesema sana wameweza. So ukitoka huku ukienda kuwafanyia kazi, kuna baadhi za vitu ambayo wanakuambia ili yenye inakukera wewe mwenye ambayo umeenda kuwafanyia nini kazi. Aswa pia hata na wakubwa wetu pia ni kama wametenga slums. Vitu mingi zikitokea wanastahili kama wakubwa wetu ndio wale watu wanastahili kukua kipaumbele kukuja kusaidia wale ambao wako katika slums. Wale watu wametuachia maaskari ndio wanatudhulumu pale kwa kijiji.
Let me please translate that a little bit. The first thing she says is that there's stigma among themselves. You know, there's stigmatization, this person showing the other person this and that, or you can't do this, you can't be here. So it's among themselves. And then another point that she gives is that it's also from the outside. Well, like she gives an example of a nearby estate that where well-off people live in. These women go there to do household chores, do laundry and do other things. So it's been really hard for them during this COVID-19 season, because once you go there, there is a lot that is said to you, you know, in a way that makes you feel bad and discriminated against. So that is another party that is bringing up that discrimination. And then she also talks about the government. They feel like the government has left them, it's not with them, they're not taking care of them. And for them, they feel like the government has given the police the liberty to go to the settlement and do whatever they want with them. So there's a lot of police brutality as a result of that, and no one is taking accountability for it.
Mm-hmm. Christine, thank you so much. There's another question here. The question reads, and I'm thinking, Dr. Borret, this might be for you to answer. It says, as we organize to start COVID-19 vaccine trials in Brazil and soon in sub-Saharan Africa, I would be deeply grateful for the panelists' insight into what their community's concerns about participating in vaccine research are, given the context they have illuminated today. So what issues must we researchers address to include communities impacted in vaccine studies and create truly collaborative research that responds to their community's needs, priorities, and hopes for the future?
I think that's a great question, and
yeah.
I'd like to start answering to this question by we have been talking throughout this panel about local racism, and we have been trying to apply a lens of racism in Brazil and in Kenya, but we have to talk about worldwide racism. And when we decide that we are first of all try to do the trials of a vaccine in Africa and in Brazil, why is that so? Why we are choosing to start a trial of something that we still are not sure if it works properly in the countries that are considered poor, and with the people that are considered the ones that are okay to die? I think that would be for me the first question of all. And On the other hand, to try to answer the question, I think that something extremely important is what Mariana was trying to say throughout the panel. Like, is the vaccine the thing that is more important in the favelas? Who has decided that? Who has listened to the favelas and to the Africa continent and the Africa countries about what they actually need when we're talking about COVID-19? Of course, the vaccine is extremely important, but would that be the first priority? I would not be able to say that. I think that we are facing difficulty in having tests, in trying to understand how the COVID-19 actually spreads in Brazil. I can, from what Christine was saying, I can realize that this is the same in Kenya. We do not actually have tests for everybody. So we do not know. In Jacarezinho, the favela where I work at, we were only testing people who died of suspected COVID or who had the form of COVID-19 that had to be hospitalized. So we cannot actually and truly dimension COVID-19 impact in the favelas. So we don't have tests. We also do not have hospitalization for everyone who needs it in Brazil. So vaccine is extremely important. Yes, it's going to be extremely important for the whole world. But I think that prioritizing and understanding which is important first, there's a whole bunch of things that the favelas and the communities in Brazil needs. And that would be income and a fixed income for people to survive COVID-19. Also testing and guarantees of a public healthcare system that would be able to hospitalize everyone who needs hospitalization. And yes, vaccine is going to be important as well. But why are we deciding to try and to use the vaccine as a trial in Brazil and in the African continent? I think that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves. And isn't it a form of racism as well? I think this is important for us to try to understand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Borret. I think those points are very, very important for us to consider. And with that said, I unfortunately need to wrap us up, and this is terrible. I feel like we're just starting to get to the meat of conversation and very important dialogue, and I just hope that we can find ways to continue to come together. I think it's so important for all of us to come together, despite the fact that we're coming from different cultures and different countries. There are such common threads of historical injustice that the globe is experiencing, and that the COVID-19 pandemic is sort of bringing out to the surface things that have been there in existence for a very, very long time. I want to thank our panelists so very much from the bottom of my heart for being so true, for giving up your time, for speaking so openly and graciously with us, for our translators, Mara and Teresa, for our CGC representatives and partners, for our colleague, Professor Samantha Winter from Columbia School of Social Work, who's very much responsible for bringing us all together in these wonderful panels. I'm humbled and moved and grateful, and I wish everybody the very best, and I look forward to participating and continuing to hear these very rich and important stories. And I'm unfortunately sorry to end, but Teresa, yeah, thanks.
So everybody, again, thank you so much to all our panelists. This is by far one of the most important conversations we've had lately. And this is what the Global Centers hope to do, is we hope to foster conversations all around the world with our Columbia faculty and our regional partners and regional network. And this is not a comfortable conversation, but this is a much needed conversation. And I cannot emphasize enough, Amy and everybody, how important it is that you have joined us today, and I do appreciate that. I want to thank our audience. We've had a good number of people watching us, very important people watching us, which is pretty amazing. And we will post the video of this webinar in our YouTube channel. And of course, we're open to more questions. If any of you from the audience would like to contact any of the panelists, please feel free to write to us at the Global Centers, and we'll make sure to do the connections. And this is it. I wish we had more time, because this is such a cool conversation, such an important conversation, and I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone is healthy, and I do appreciate everyone's participation and collaboration.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.